Hello, friends, and welcome to Books on Faith and Meaning. My name is Katie Grosh, and I'm the Faith Initiative Coordinator at Grace Farms Foundation. And I am so delighted to welcome you to this time of conversation with Dr. Keri Day about her book, Notes of a Native Daughter, Testifying in Theological Education. Our discussion today is part of the Books on Faith and Meaning series, oriented around the Faith Initiative's core question: what is the shape of flourishing life? Each month, as we engage with different texts, from ancient classics to newly published books, from a variety of religious and philosophical traditions, we want to ask and encounter these important questions of meaning and purpose in the company of others. Reading is an important part of our journey, and we believe that these texts can connect us to people, histories, and ideas that can contribute substantially to our quest for flourishing life, both for our own journeys and for our communities. Before we begin today, I just want to give a quick reminder that this webinar conversation is being recorded and will be available on our website, gracefarms.org/faith, to watch, rewatch, or share with a friend. And if you are with us live today, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any point during the discussion. So no need to wait until the end of the hour. You can just type in your questions to the Q&A box as they occur to you, and Matt will weave them in throughout our conversation. And with that, I would like to introduce Matthew Croasmun, Faith Initiative Director at Grace Farms Foundation.
Thanks, Katie. This time of the year, it's an exciting time. The end of the summer, the new school year is coming. We just got my daughter's school schedule for the fall. She's beginning middle school. Very excited, going through the schedule, figuring out what is in store for her. When we think about sites that reveal and shape our visions of flourishing life, few are as impactful as education. In education, especially maybe in the humanities, we discern the shape of flourishing life. And we hope that in the process, we might even be formed for flourishing life, formed to live it ourselves, and even more to be prepared to make it possible for the communities we are a part of. That somehow through education, we might be formed as people prepared to help our communities flourish. Perhaps in no form of education is that more clear than in theological education. Theology, I take it, should be about discerning, articulating, and pursuing visions of flourishing life. And theological education abounds with language of formation of the student. But that doesn't always mean that theological education works. All too often, what is formed in students bears more similarity to the professor than to the shape of a student ready to flourish as only they can. In our book for today, Notes of a Native Daughter, the book speaks to both the shortcomings and the unique promises of theological education for flourishing life. And so we are honored to have with us today the author of this book, Professor Keri Day. Professor Day is Associate Professor of Constructive Theology and African American Religion at Princeton Theological Seminary. She earned her PhD in religion from Vanderbilt University, an MA in religion and ethics from Yale University Divinity School, and a Bachelor of Science from Tennessee State University. Her teaching and research interests are in womanist, feminist theologies, social critical theory, cultural studies, economics, and Afro-Pentecostalism. She is author of several books, including our book today. Keri, if I may, so glad to have you with us today.
I am so happy to be here, Matt. I remember several years ago, we were having a conversation at Yale Divinity School concerning flourishing, and it is wonderful these years later to be back with you discussing this book.
Well, I'm really grateful for this book. I spend a lot of my days thinking about education and trying to grow as a teacher and better understand what it is that's happening in my classroom, what it is I wish were happening in my classroom. And there's so much in this book that's just um, so honest about as I said, the problems but the hopes and these sort of unique opportunities, but unique opportunities for growth, I think, are actually related to unique opportunities for harm that show up in the theological education space. I was really intrigued, and you sort of really hooked me right from the beginning as you sort of described a sort of moment early on in your life when you say, I discovered that questions and conversation are signs of faith. Questions help us to recognize what we value most, how such questioning is about honoring the significance of that which is being questioned. Some of us might sort of think, like, especially if you're not like around the theological education world, you might think like, maybe that's true like in a math class or something like where it was like the curiosity is like always, appreciated, but maybe in theology, we might have the idea that like, no, that's where questions are dangerous and doubt is something dangerous. But you open up this really much more generous and sort of hopeful space. So what are you trying to tell us about questions and conversation that are signs of faith?
Yeah, so I talk about sort of two sites of my formation. What I refer to as home. On the one hand, you have the theological academy that I was trained in, where, I mean, for the most part, I went to primarily like liberal theological institutions where questions were sort of honored, right? That's sort of the foundation of how we think about the search for theological knowledge. But ironically, I begin, and I say ironically in a humorous way, because I begin that first chapter with my own Pentecostal tradition as a way of discussing, precisely what you're referring to. Questions are signs of faith, because it was a central contradiction in my experience of my own Pentecostal tradition. On the one hand, and hopefully we will get to this, what I mean when I speak of testifying. But there was this practice within my tradition called testifying or testimony service. And this particular form of testifying, it sort of invited conversation. It invited questions. It invited a kind of dialogical process, whether that was just the speaker speaking and others in the congregation going, amen, affirming some of the complexities that they're speaking of that they've experienced throughout the week. But the point here is that questions were honored as signs of faith. But here was the contradiction. At the same time, within my tradition, you had a kind of dogmatic authoritarianism that operated, right? And within the popular religious imagination, Pentecostalism is seen as rather dogmatic, as you said, as refusing to think about faith as questions, but rather as a kind of exercise in conformity in terms of what's gone before. And part of what I wanted to do is I wanted to show this complexity within my tradition is just not restricted to the Pentecostal tradition. It also shows up in the theological academy. Right? You have a liberal context that I'm a part of, in which questions are welcome, but simultaneously something else is transpiring. You have a kind of dogmatic authoritarianism as it relates to how for example, the sort of categories that we can even use in speaking about, say, who God is, or what we know about God, or, for example, primarily how we experience God. We could say through the category of rationality that privileges the mind, perhaps, and meditation, in exclusion or underestimating the body as or the senses, one could even say, as a primary source of knowledge. So to get at your question, I mean, this is part of all that's going on when I am speaking of this profound need to think about our questions as signs of faith, because after all, we are participating in the life of God, which is so infinite, which is so ineffable, beyond our grasp, even as we come to know something about God within the Christian tradition through Jesus Christ.
Amazing. And it's one of the things I love about the book is that you get into really concrete practices. You're just telling us about like life in your church and for those like me who didn't grow up, I grew up in a Swedish American church, so like conformity was a high value. Like,
Yes.
raising your hands up above your elbows was dangerous business. So I love the way that you're so hospitable, inviting us in to sort of at least imagine these spaces as you're inviting us into them. In this practice of bearing witness, I have to say, like, again, coming from a different sort of Christian tradition, I often think of the testimony as actually having a pretty rigorous form, or it's it's like a genre unto itself. It's like I did this, and I went the wrong sort of way, and then I saw the light, and now everything's better. But you describe a sort of testimony practice that's a lot broader. How do you see sort of genres or forms sort of at work? And how do we think about sort of, oh yeah, there are some forms here, but this really sort of explosive, very I don't know, just sort of fertile set of possibilities in this practice.
Absolutely. So if you don't mind, very quickly, I sort of opened up the introduction just in 3 or 4 paragraphs, being descriptive, and even in the first chapter about testimony service within the Afro-Pentecostal tradition, which really has its antecedents in really slave religious practices. I mean, it really does, in the plantation Christian community of the enslaved. But essentially, it was when the speaker got up, as I talk about in the book, and proceeded to speak about what God had done for them, whether it was joys, whether it was sorrows, whatever it was. To me, what is particularly important, at least for this text Notes of a Native Daughter, to this practice of testimony in the Black Pentecostal tradition, I would say is 2 major things. The first thing, it's not just the speaker testifying and bearing witness. There's a way in which the practice itself is a collective and collaborative process from the very beginning. And so the speaker stands up and speaks, but along the way, you always have the congregation saying amen. Some will go, mm-hmm. Others might be more bodily and bring their arms in with a groan and do this. Within the Pentecostal community, some might get so caught up and enraptured in what you're speaking about that they begin shouting and dancing, right? That one might say, well, it's rather disruptive, but actually it's a confirmation, an affirmation of what's being said. And so there's first a way in which testifying, although there is a process in which the individual speaker speaks, it is always and already a collective endeavor that speaks to a collective consciousness, seeking and speaking the will of God as they see it. And then secondly, what I love about testimony service within my tradition, speaking to the dynamic possibilities you just alluded to, is oftentimes in the process of the individual speaker testifying and the community responding, the speaker moves into a new revelation of oneself. And this is really, really key. There is this new revelation that emerges that the speaker was not even anticipating about themselves, other people, God, and the broader world. And so even when we speak about, and I know we'll talk about this when it comes to the knower and how we come to know things about ourselves, about the world, about God, about theological education, it seems to me part of the dynamic possibilities that you are alluding to through the testimony service within my tradition is this space for new knowledge, a new understanding, a revelation of self and of God and others that's always present.
That's so beautiful. And it is this image that you return to again and again in the book. So you invite us to sort of think about this very material practice, and then you sort of return again and again. And if I remember, I think one of the things that really stuck out to me was the sort of maybe just further elaborating or inviting you to elaborate on some of the sort of the dynamic possibilities. One possibility is that there might be reconciliation that needs to happen, right? Someone might stand up and say like, hey, there's something not right in this community. There's something not right in me, or there's something not right in a relationship that's in this room. And even in this moment, I'm not just standing up to say that or to make my complaint public, like, because I don't know, the community's in this space, because God's at work in this space. That reconciliation can and should happen right now. If I'm reading you right, years later, you're in a space at Princeton Theological Seminary thinking about institutional reparations for the seminary's having benefited from slavery for many, many, many years. And if I hear you right, a sort of community, student, faculty with the trustees, that meeting suddenly becomes, in certain ways, a sort of testimony service in which some of that reconciliation, I mean, who would think, right? That's the most politically sort of fraught sort of moment. I've been in some of those rooms, right? Where white folk are working hard not to say the wrong thing, both in front of other white folk and given their institutional responsibilities, but also wanting somehow to save at least the sort of liberal face. And anyway, like, that's such a anyway, maybe you could sort of speak to, like, where tell me, I guess I'm particularly intrigued by this sort of possibilities of reconciliation that are sort of opened up in this sort of unique space, and what makes that space, and how on earth can that space happen both in certain ways, right, in this like Afro-Pentecostal church, but then also sort of like erupt in certain ways, like maybe one of the last spaces you would expect it to show up.
Yeah. Oh, so much here, in your question. So I think of my childhood tradition and testimony service, and it seems to me there were always two things operating whenever those moments of reconciliation bubbled up, or I would say deep intimacy and a sense of belonging, of repair, that something had been done that repaired the community. And the first one was this sense of utter vulnerability, right? I mean, I think that the practice of testifying and the way that I've described it within my tradition is, in part, what it does is it invites, or maybe I should use a stronger word here, it compels people to take risks and to be vulnerable. And when I say be vulnerable, what I mean is there has to be some kind of openness to a better way of living well together, a better way of loving well together, a sense that where we are is a broken state. And so that's what I mean by being vulnerable, right? There has to be that fundamental recognition, because if there isn't, then the vulnerability that is needed, the openness to allow for those moments of reconciling exchange to occur, they can't occur. So that's the first thing, that when the speaker gets up, there's something already troubling, to use the old Black church mothers, troubling my soul. There's something already troubling my soul, right? And now is a time to begin that process of speaking and of being open to how God might repair the situation with our actions. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it also involves a kind of, I like to say, epistemic humility. This recognition that how I've come to understand or know a certain situation. So it could be within a church. Well, no, what they did was wrong because this is what they were doing in the moment. Epistemic humility says, well, maybe how I've come to know what I know about this situation, this exchange, is wrong. What if there are other kinds of possibilities inherent within this that might make how I'm thinking about the situation wrong? And so then how does that translate to the institutional context? And really what I wrote about in that fourth chapter, where you have trustees and faculty and students all present, is I felt like in that exchange, when the white young woman student gets up, right, and says, I'll be willing to forego my scholarship, because I know that institutionally, so much as a white Presbyterian woman of what we have has been built on this long history of disenfranchisement. It seems to me that institutions, what they need, and I think part of the problem that I'm trying to diagnose in the book, is the first, as I talked about my community, is this acknowledgement that something is wrong, this sense of vulnerability. And that's within the one trustee that I mentioned. So it wasn't the institution, if you recall, that I was mentioning. it was that one trustee, right, that takes a risk, says, you know what, even though they want me to stay here in terms of what I can say, how I should engage the students, I'm willing to take a risk and be vulnerable and be open to another moment. So I think that has to be present more broadly institutionally. And then second, a sense of epistemic humility for institutions to say, well, maybe how we're looking at a particular issue. Well, we have 10 scholarships for African Americans. What more do they need? Or we've done X, Y, and Z. Why are they asking, as we did on last year, for Miller's name to be taken off the Miller Chapel here at PTS, as he was a slave-holding professor? And students said, wait a minute, we're not going to worship in a space that continues to be named after a slave-holding person. So it's that epistemic humility. And I think this is part of what I'm getting at in the sorts of, I say, virtues, I'll say, that institutions, at least, in theological education need to be open to.
That's so helpful. And thanks for going through me as I sort of zoom through the book there to connect this all the way through. But you've laid a lot of foundations by the time we get to that scene. But one of the things that you're drawing our attention to all the way through is what you simply call desire. But it's and this is a word, if I remember correctly, eros, right, is the title of Willie Jennings' last chapter of his title of the chapter of his book in this series in which you're writing. He too sees desire, and desire in a sort of unique sense. Usually, I'm a Paul scholar, right? So desire is usually a problem.
That's one, right.
But you're hopeful, right, for sort of cultivating a certain sort of desire. And I think if I'm following you right, you're sort of very attentive to it because it's sort of a sign that some of what you're talking about is, oh, there's a new possibility here because there's a desire that this person feels for some sort of relatedness with this other person where they might not otherwise have felt it. So can you just give us that picture of desire, and even I think you've already used the language of intimacy even. What are you talking about here in the educational space?
So, I think that desire is I would say sort of the deep theological stuff that we see in Acts, and literally in the you could say establishment, in the journey of the early church. And so if you don't mind, the third chapter I sort of commend progressive Pentecostalism, and in particular the Fellowship for Affirming Ministries, Bishop Yvette Flunder's work. And she talks about a theology of inclusion, but I'm sort of wanting to focus in on how she speaks about a theology of inclusion of desire. And one of the examples that she gives in the early church is the exchange between Peter and Cornelius, right? Where Peter is very apprehensive about who can be included, right, within the community. This is something that comes up and up again for Peter, and we see Peter go to the rooftop, and he has a spiritual experience where essentially the Spirit is communicating to Peter, "Do not call unclean what I have made clean." But I mean, this is really, really important for the knock that he receives at the door, which is Cornelius, right? Cornelius, at least in Peter's mind, not being the kind of person that he would imagine, so to speak, could be engrafted into the community. But in fact, this is precisely where the Spirit is moving in terms of this sense of radical inclusion. And the point here, I think, in the third chapter, when I'm speaking about desire, is that when it comes to communities of love, of care, of justice, even of reconciliation and embrace, it is important to get the structural piece right, the material piece right. And I think that is something that liberal theological institutions are sort of very good at. But the one thing that I often become very concerned about is this other side of what I understand, like what the gospel calls us to. And this has to do with the question of desire, the question of belonging and intimacy, and sort of within a highly fragmented society. I mean, that was going on in the early church. One could speak of that today, especially in a highly fragmented society, that certain political and social issues, even like religious issues that are abounding, it prevents precisely this desiring of the other, that I see so critically important to the formation of the early church community, of the Pentecostal community, of, I would say, the Christian community, because what we see is Pentecost just not for as a denomination, but in Acts we see Pentecost as a central experience for the Christian community of radical inclusion. And so for me, this is really, really important, right? That, progressive Pentecostalism, theology of inclusion that Flunder talks about, she uses Peter and Cornelius, that desire is something that we are called to within the gospel as being the condition for the possibility of repair and justice and reconciliation. And when we lose that piece, structural repair is important, but when we lose that piece as well, part of what I literally say is we are lost, because we have misunderstood just how radical the gospel truly is.
Yeah. So the stakes aren't just institutional, they're not just structural, they're also personal. And maybe this gets back to some of the vulnerability that you were commending beforehand. But I'm very cognizant, as I know you are, and you speak about this in the book, that especially in like a multiracial community, the risk of vulnerability isn't shared equally.
Yeah.
And I appreciate some of those like very straightforward ways that you you just name this. At one point in the book, you say so many liberal conversations are halted because white interlocutors demand that the discussion of race, and in this case reparations, be on their terms. Key words that are thrown out are civility, goodwill, and solidarity. These words do not really capture the risk and sacrifice white communities are called to embody as they discuss intersectional forms of structural racism. Such conversations involve entering into the worlds of Black individuals who experience daily racist assault. And yeah, as I said, I appreciate your just candor, and you are just like, you're just going right at it. This is a real thing that we experience, in so many of our institutions in this country are still predominantly oriented around whiteness. And even the possibility of the sorts of conversations that you're talking about can be often are resisted on exactly these sorts of terms. But it can be disoriented for someone who feels like, how can it be a bad thing to ask for civility or goodwill? And yet there's something often that's being missed when it's white voices who are calling, who are sort of policing, the sort of conversation around civility. Could you just help us understand that better?
Yeah. So it took me about a year to get the first 3 or 4 paragraphs to that 4th chapter right, because what I realized, this is precisely has to do with the imbalance that you're speaking of in terms of risk taking, like, those that have experienced institutional harm and trauma, rightly so, they're suspicious of this kind of call that I am issuing. I mean, I even have really good colleagues that are like, oh, I love the book chapters 1 through 3. I'm unsure about 4. Like, I'm just unsure. And I so appreciate the honesty. And this is why I at least try to speak to this a little, but in the 4th chapter, the first 3 or 4 paragraphs, if you recall, I speak about this vision for cultivating desire for each other. Doesn't, at least for me, I don't issue it in the form of a demand, but in the form of a prayer. And I think that at least this language for me, someone writing about this and issuing a call to do this, I really felt that I had an ethical responsibility to frame it in such a way, because to issue it as a demand, which is what not just the history of theological education, but the history of this nation has done, in saying, well, no, sort of the multicultural language of, part of reconciliation is us just coming to the table and discussing our differences and getting along, so that if you're not willing, because you have a different interpretation, say, of whiteness, right, not as a difference, but as something that has structurally created the ecology, the racial ecology that we're in, then in some ways you're not committed to the process of reconciliation and so forth. So in some ways, this multicultural rhetoric issues forth the call of reconciliation as a demand. And that is profoundly problematic, because it reinforces the very trauma that we're trying to resist. And so for me, the language of prayer, and now that I look back, I wish I could have filled that out more, like really fill that out. But part of what I'm getting at here in the form of a prayer is that it takes into account these kinds of anxieties and these kinds of concerns, and it may even mean that there are moments and points where those that have been on the end of experiencing historical trauma may have to take a step back in order to figure out how they can participate in the conversation before taking a step in. And I make it very clear throughout chapters 1 through 3 that being undone is not even possible without attending to structural repair. And I think that's a really important point for me to make, that the question of desire in some ways can't hinge on cheap forgiveness, right? I mean, we talk Bonhoeffer cheap grace, but cheap forgiveness, that there has to be a real reckoning, right, institutionally, with the problems of whiteness, with the problems of structural injustice, but that in that, on the terms, at the pace, in the rhythm, with the rhythms of those who have endured historical trauma, how then do we think about desire? So for me, it's in the form of a prayer. It's an ongoing beseeching of the Spirit of God in some ways that makes possible precisely that moment.
Well, let's try to, if I can, let's try to step back a little bit then, because I rushed us ahead a little bit, and I want to pick up at least one key piece that you've mentioned a couple times here, and seems really important as some of the preparatory work and storytelling and the testifying that you're doing here, is to talk about the different epistemologies that you're formed in. One in the Afro-Pentecostal. We could actually talk about multiple, and you do. You're really good about talking about multiple. And then there's in the sort of Black, the Black theological space, both sort of within the HBCU or imagined within that sort of space, and in the Black Studies program that you directed. But maybe we can especially draw our attention to these two different spaces of the Afro-Pentecostal and then the sort of white liberal sort of elite academic space. And you've mentioned epistemology several times, and different sorts of ways of knowing or thinking about what knowledge is. And even I think the epistemic humility that you've commended to us, I think, comes on the other end of this. So first recognizing that there are different epistemologies at work here. So I wonder if you just quickly, if you could just lay out for us, if I'm following you rightly, the Afro-Pentecostal epistemology is very much about the body. It's about it's enfleshed. It's communal. If it's not too Barthian to say, it's about event. It's about and then you describe your experience encountering this other epistemology, and as you say, sort of learning to pass, take it intellectually, accommodating yourself to a different, or at least being able to perform participation in a different sort of epistemology. What is that other epistemology, and what kinds of contrasts are you wanting to highlight for us? I think this is helpful for us, whether we are in coming from a Black space, coming into a white space, as your story is, or if we're traversing other sorts of paths, or even whether we're like in theological education or at all, right? Just to be able to see the sort of epistemology of whiteness, as it were, some of the sort of dominant ways of knowing that maybe we've just gone blind to because they're all around us.
Yeah, so when I speak of, and I don't write about this, so this is something in addition I've been reflecting on in my conversation with people over the book, that testifying within my tradition, that in some ways I don't just see it as a practice, which it was a practice, but as a liturgical practice, but also I fundamentally see it as an epistemology, the practiced idea of testifying. I would say primarily in two ways, and then I sort of want to put it in, I say contrast, although I say contrast with the Theological Academy, because I actually think that some of what I'm discussing in my own tradition is like present in the academy, in student groups, or in sort of spaces that one might argue are on the fringes of the academy that may not be privileged in sort of, say professorial discussions within a class or whatever. So the first thing about testifying as an epistemology within my tradition, and I talked about this, it was the collective, collaborative character of testimony. And I would say that the collective, collaborative character of knowing, it seems to me, and this is what part of what I talk about in Learning the Past, is that what has attempted to seduce people of color, and I would say even more like even non-people of color, has been, and Willie Jennings talks about this in his book, After Whiteness, is sort of the problem of mastery. Sort of this problem of mastery where it's about the autonomous. He speaks about it as sort of the hetero white male marching, the sort of subject that marches through history that people are now modeling themselves after. But for me, it's this autonomous subject. Part of what it means to know something, to be on a journey of knowing something, is as an individual, you do the research, you learn what's needed from your professor, you take the test. In other words, the learning process, or how we come to know what we know, is so encased within a kind of autonomous ecology, right? Where it's about the individual. So even when we speak of, the genius of a particular person, or what it means to be successful within the academy, whether a student or a faculty member, that's often a discussion about what an individual has done by way of writing books or by way of something else in the academy. So that the first thing that I'm at least wanting to do is to privilege a form of knowing. And I would argue that actually this, for the most part, tends to be the way we come to know. We just don't acknowledge it as such. Right. So in some ways we are seduced, and we even run after, and we attempt to model this myth of the brilliant autonomous subject becoming successful and sort of performing mastery on the canonical text, whatever it is that sort of constitutes what knowledge is, right? And so that's the first thing. And I think that then testifying as epistemology wants to implode that assumption of the autonomous subject, that knowledge is always and already a collaborative, collective endeavor. And when it's not, then it becomes a very harmful, traumatic ecology. And this is why we see within theological education and the university more broadly, lots of intellectual and psychological trauma that's happening with students, with professors, say, who don't make, even with professors who do have tenure, they're having these kinds of issues. And I'll say the second thing, in addition to sort of the autonomous subject, you talked about the body, I speak about the body. I say in the book as the primary vehicle that mediates divine presence, that in some ways that our bodies within a Pentecostal space, as we are being demonstrative in our worship, that in some ways it teaches us something about who God is and who we are. And to me, that is really, really important, because it seems to me in much of, and I say academic because I think that theological education is simply symptomatic of a larger Western educational model that we have that's a problem. I think we're mirroring something that's a larger problem with education in America. And that is that it's not about, or there is a kind of disdain or awareness of using the senses that would include the body as a way of accessing knowledge, as a way of understanding ourselves and the world. And that really what is privileged for the most part is the mind. So I give one example in the book that the measure of a student's theological success is often how well they can write the paper, how well they can argue, make the philosophical argument, so that one measurement, right, becomes the measurement for how we think about knowledge itself, how knowledge is accessed and understood, right? So I mean, of course, we can continue to have this discussion, Matt, but I think that this is a profoundly important point about epistemology. We need new forms and ways of knowing. And this is why I wanted to sort of lift up my tradition as a way of thinking about, right, these very harmful practices within the academy that are really from the beginning are not true to how knowledge is actually going on, like how the production of knowledge is actually taking place anyway, but then penalizing people when they're wanting to lean in precisely to that process.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot recently about the Gospel of Mark on this point. Only people who say they know who Jesus is in the Gospel of Mark. And the Gospel of Mark tells you at the beginning, the most important knowledge, whatever knowledge is something about the identity of Jesus. The only people that say they've got that worked out are the demons, Peter right before he gets called Satan, the centurion who kills Jesus. These are the people who say they've got it all figured out. And it had never occurred to me until you were just describing it. Those are also all solo sort of epistemological endeavors, right? Whereas I take it the epistemological models, the model learners of the Gospel of Mark are the disciples when they wonder, but right, they respond with wonder and amazement and awe, or they ask questions, but they're almost never, I can't think of a question of that sort, of the sort of model type that's asked by just one disciple. It's always a group of people or a crowd, right? Or of course, paradigmatically in the Gospel of Mark, the women at the tomb at the end, right? Who are terrified. I think they're responding exactly the right way. They're amazed. And but that too is a collective embodied sort of, so there should be resources within the theological tradition for thinking other than, right? I mean, I just think of that demonic voice. I forget if it's even in chapter 1. It's not much later than chapter 2 in Mark, right? What do you want from me, basically, Jesus of Nazareth? Like, I know who you are, right? Says the voice of the demon. This is the demonic voice, right? But that's the voice that's going to get an A on the paper, like in an academic context. Like, I know, right?
Wow.
Like, well done, right?
Wow.
Like, we are we are selecting for demonic knowledge, right? And for the student who says, like, I don't know, or I wonder, or who could this be?
Yes.
Even the wind and the waves obey him, right? who's just got a question, right? Like that would not pass on an exam. But these are the models in the oldest gospel, for what it's worth. And I love that you're pointing us to these sorts of, to help us see the ways that we have practices that we wouldn't otherwise see, because it's hidden on purpose, right? It wants to stay, right? And you take up this language of you say that this is some of the work of the Black women scholars who need to forgive me, I copied the quote and I don't have the attribution, but you're taking up someone else's work, and you say that Black women scholars need to work with the sleeves rolled up, busily sharpening our oyster knives, right?
Katie Cannon, yes.
There you go, Cannon.
Yeah.
So tell me about that oyster knife work. And because it really inspired, I thought, like, yes, this is why we need more Black women scholars doing this work.
Yes. So, so Katie Cannon is actually borrowing that phrase from Zora Neale Hurston, who in an essay, and right now it's in the footnote, but I'm trying to remember the essay. I think the title of it is Living Out Loud, a Colored Woman Like Me. I think it's something I think I might have two of the words that need to go somewhere else. But Zora Neale Hurston, of course, Katie Cannon takes this up, is referring to this idea that, like, oysters are hard to open, right? They're hard to open. But if we're going to open it to get to sort of the delectable part, it takes work. And so Hurston was sort of thinking about the oyster as an sort of an example, a metaphor for the world. The world is your oyster, so to speak, right? But the world is like really difficult. The world is hard to understand. The world, there are so many illusions and pretensions, and it is all other kinds of complex and contradictory things that transpire in the world, and of which one of them for Zora Neale Hurston was race and the very problematic position of the poor Black woman for Zora Neale Hurston in particular. And so part of what she was trying to get at through this very rich metaphor that Katie Cannon is taking up is that, similar to the world being an oyster, right? The oysters are difficult, they're hard, that the world is difficult and hard. But as one begins with their oyster knife to begin to sharpen, right? And use their oyster knife in some ways to get to the center, to that beautiful, delectable part, right? The beauties. I mean, I like oysters. I'm sorry for those that don't like oysters. This metaphor might not work. When you get to the center of that, right, and you're able to get what you want, what's absolutely tasty and good, the beauty, so to speak, of life, Hurston would say. But that has taken work, and part of what Hurston is calling folks into, particularly in this case, for her it was Black artists in particular. But for Katie Cannon, it's the Theological Academy, just not Black scholars. She's speaking to the Theological Academy writ large in saying that if we want to understand the religious experiences of diverse people groups that constitute theological education, we're going to have to begin to sharpen our oyster knives. This is an oyster, the world, the diversity, the cacophony, one could even say. But part of our responsibility, our work, is to do the work, to sharpen our oyster knives and to begin that process in a way that is integrous. And so for me, that's such a powerful metaphor, because in my opinion, it first suggests that it takes real work, real work, rolling up your sleeves and laboring. But anyone that has ever cracked open an oyster, it's a labor of love. Like, you're doing it because you're really intentional that that's what you want to be doing in the moment. and that kind of radical intentionality, that kind of labor of love, of attempting to break open something to have a better understanding of what it is, a clear understanding, even if just for a minute, because the world is fastly shifting and changing. If even for a minute, as a way to live well in it, to respond to those who I would see as my neighbors, even those I don't quite understand, is a profound call. So to me, that is such an essential task that we need to think about more as Cannon's call.
Right. Well, maybe this is something of the sort of the delectable center. You've used the language, I think, already a couple times in our conversation, but it really feels like where the book lands is you talk about these moments of being undone as one of the goals. Well, you ask a question. I love this. It's actually one of my pieces of advice always to new preachers. And often I will make it to them in the way that I'll ask them, is there some way that you could make your main point, at least the first time you made it, with a question, rather, right? By asking a what if question, right? And you give us this what if question. What if theological education could be experienced as a site where we might be undone by each other? um, I could probably fill the last 10 minutes of our time just reading to folks your beautiful language as you as you spin this out, but I'll invite you to do a little. I may throw some in anyway, but I would love to, because you write so beautifully. It's really honestly, it's so inspiring, and I sort of think about like the moments in my classroom that are the moments you can't make happen, but are everything you want. And that's what's, I mean, it's like my own struggle as a teacher is coming to terms, just regularly coming again to terms with that, because it's so the opposite of mastery, right? Mastery, I can happen the thing that like is important, but to just realize as a teacher, because I mean, that's one of the things that jumps out to me is like, oh, if our classrooms became about trying to make our classrooms sites where we might be undone by one another, then we are giving ourselves a goal, a prayer, a hope that we can't, that we just can't accomplish. Like we have to depend on one another, on divine presence, on these. Anyway, so, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Tell me, like, what is so powerful? What do you mean by being undone? And what's so powerful about that?
I did not think this way when I wrote the book. So this has been a sort of leaning into, I think, a new way of thinking. One of the and I'm going to answer that question very directly. One of the conversations that the 12 scholars within theological education between the Times book series we talked about for 3 years is theological education. Is it in need of renovation? That is the house, the structure of how we do theological education. Is it in need of a renovation? Or are we looking at the end of theological education as such? In other words, we need to build a new house altogether. That what we need is a kind of, when I say a world-ending moment, and in like literally structurally speaking to how we have thought about and done theological education to build something new. When I was writing the book, I tended to think in terms of the language of renovation. I even think I say that. I'm not sure where, but it seems like I use the term renovation. Because I absolutely feel, I mean, to do that, well, what do you do with like even the good parts, right? I mean, it's sort of like, you know, intertwined or sort of the very harmful parts. But as I talk about, theological education is yet home to Native daughters like myself. I mean, where would we be without the Cones, the Maria Sassi Diaz, the Ivonne Jabata, the Katie Cannons, and Dolores Williams? But I now am absolutely convinced that if we are to be a site where these sorts of things are possible, including becoming undone, I am convinced that theological education as we know it must be rebuilt from the ground up. And the reason why I'm saying that is because this is something I did not, even though my work centers on this, my academic work, I never thought or talked about this in my book, which is rather interesting. And that is the profound corporatization that theological education has been shaped by. I mean, the capitalist impulse, not just of the university, but now of theological education over, you know, the last several decades at least. You know, the problem is, at least as I see it, as I diagnose it now, is becoming a site where we can be undone. But part of the problem is, I think in some ways, people are sort of, I don't want to say compensate, that's probably the wrong word, but they sort of receive sort of benefits. Benefits are attached to maintaining the status quo, the sort of structural things that drive what the academy is and what theological education is in particular. So that would be tenure. It would be, you know, certain rewards that come with monographs being published and grants being garnered, but this is in relationship to the individual, right? And as a result, you even have, look at the PhD level, where students in one school are internally competing with each other in order to receive fellowships. What does that do to intellectual community? to the collective and collaborative enterprise of knowledge, right? And so I know this might sound more like a stream of consciousness here, which it is, because I'm still thinking about it. But my concern right now is in becoming undone within theological education. It seems to me literally our structures must change. Our structures disallow precisely this moment. So the board of trustee member, for example, has to think about one's own duties and responsibilities and potential liabilities. If they say certain things to student while true and integrous, could affect the integrity of the institution, right? That's trying to, make sure that the endowment, sometimes, endowment goals can totally clash with basic issues of, respecting the rights and the human dignity of the students and the faculty. So for me, it's such a complex answer for me, because on the one hand, I think at a very intimate level, one-on-one, I've seen these moments. But the question, it seems to me, that you're talking about is institutionally. And so I don't want to say there is no hope institutionally. You can see, because I truly don't believe that. I mean, I truly am hopeful. So that would be dishonest to my own sentiment. But at the same time, I recognize the profound obstacles at a corporate capitalist level that from the very beginning structurally make impossible precisely these moments at an institutional level. And so I think this is something more and more we're going to have to discuss in theological education if we are to be released to a future or multiple futures where this context of being undone is a real possibility. But perhaps we're right back at the beginning of the conversation, the impossible possibility. And perhaps what I'm speaking to is precisely what I talk about in the book, The Impossible Possibility.
Yeah, no, that seems quite right. And we get hints of this of these questions, right, towards the end of the book in your postscript, right?
Yeah.
Will theological education tear down its own idols and monuments dedicated to ongoing whiteness and structural racism?
I wrote that?
Yes,
okay. Okay.
You were on your way. You were on your way. It was your last thought. But yeah, I think these are big questions, and the sort of the personal and institutional, the impossible possibility. Not to be too pious about it, but I think maybe this is part of what leads one back again to something like the transforming presence of God being just the condition of the possibility of all of this, right? This is not fixable, but you offer us prayers and hope that comes through prayer. So, Keri, thank you so much for this book, for your candor in it and your candor in our conversation, and just your voice, the honesty, and also the hope. So I hope this is not our last conversation, maybe not even our last conversation in this space. We'll have you up to Grace Farms. We'll think about how we might continue to work together. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you again, Matt. It's been a pleasure.
All right. And thank you, those of us who are joining us here live, those who may be watching this later. I hope that you will continue to watch this space for this series. I have another conversation coming up next month, and a couple others through the fall. And we hope, of course, to see you at Grace Farms. Come take a river retreat. Come use this as a space to ask these questions about the shape of flourishing life, so that we can walk into it together in our communities. So until next time, be well. Thanks.